Morning, everybody. I'm Rohini Chakravarthy. I'm a partner here at NGP Capital, and we are pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with firstboard.io, and really pleased to have the panels we have this morning. And just by way of background, NGP Capital, we're a venture firm that invests in expansion stage companies, so typically Series B or so, and we are active investors, so typically we invest in take board seats and help the companies, with go to market, with building out their teams, with product market advice. So very actively involved with these companies. And one of the things that Rita and I have been talking about is how to be more collaborative with operating leaders and bringing them into the startup ecosystem. So that's the context of this discussion, and I'll turn it over to Rita. So we have a couple of panels, and I think we will close up with a breakout session where we'll have probably some more intimate conversations, smaller groups. With that, Rita, off to you.
Thank you so much, Rohini, and thank you so much for partnering with us. So for those of you who don't know who is firstboard.io, it's a collective of female operating leaders who have led major functions, it's product management, marketing, engineering, and other functions, and who are ready to join the board. We started in January of 2020, right before the COVID pandemic. And since then, we have made a lot of progress. We've curated, several different board searches, and now 5 of our initial members out of 18 are now on a board, which we're very proud of. And we're delighted to talk about, sort of what is the perspective from the operating perspective, and how can we create more diversity on company boards, in particular on tech company boards at various stages. Good. Having said that, let's start with the first segment. The first segment will be the panel of our operating leaders, and I would like to introduce our firstboard.io members who are participating in this discussion right now. Albie Kearns. Albie, can you raise your hand so everyone knows who you are? Albie Kearns is the CTO of Puppet, and she's also on the board of Lightbend as a result of firstboard.io's curated search. Michonne Pinnix. Michonne, can you raise your hand? Michonne is the COO at Chimera Bioengineering. And Paula Skokowski, she is the CMO at Incognia. Paula, can you raise your hand? Paula actually was the first member of firstboard.io. She was the one who, I had the first conversation with Paula, and so I feel particularly grateful for her kicking this off. And then Avital Aurora, who joined us shortly after, she is the VP of Engineering at Salesforce, and she's leading the engineering for the flagship product of Sales Cloud. So she has big responsibility and a big team. So welcome, our panelists, and I'm so glad you're here. Good. Let's get to our first question. You've all been in senior operating roles at technology companies, or in Michonne's case, in the biotech ecosystem, and you have been leading major functions, and you have been, you've been presenting to the board, and it would be kind of great to see sort of what have you observed, what kind of pattern have you seen during those board meetings, as a functional leader, but not a board member. I'm going to start with Albie.
That's a great question, and I think one of the things that I've had a chance to, as an observer, but is to really kind of understand the dynamics at play and a lot of the background and the context that happens in advance of those discussions, and and as an operator and a participant in board discussions, it gives you a great sense of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of feedback and advice, and it gives me a chance as a board director to also approach conversations and discussions with a lot more empathy and understanding that there's a lot of context behind that. And it's a really helpful reminder for me to kind of practice that nose in, hands out, and really kind of understand where the limits of advice that I should give and the context that I should frame it in.
Abby, would you say your perspective has changed. Before, prior to being on a board, you presented to the board, but you weren't in the closed board meeting. So would you say there was sort of a real eye opener or something you didn't expect? Did you see any kind of key differences there?
I mean, not really. I think most of the closed sessions are really targeted around voting matters anyways. So, prior to being at Puppet, I was CEO of Cloud Foundry Foundation. So I ran our boards for, nearly 5 years there. So I'm accustomed to really being part of those. So I think from that perspective, it wasn't a big change for me.
Thank you, Abby. Michonne, you have been part of several companies, large companies, Amgen, several startup companies. You have been part of board meetings. What have you seen?
I mean, aside from the dynamics that Abby mentioned, I would also say the meat and potatoes that I'm used to seeing as an operator are really around, two major components, and that's around the financial health of the company, and then also around, the infrastructure, the support, and the resourcing as they move forward. So in that first bucket, what I'm used to, when I'm an invited guest to the board, what I'm used to doing is talking about, okay, here's what the operations look like. Here's how we're spending our money. And in biotech, it's predominantly on the people and on the research. And then there also another aspect of, strategy. How are we progressing against their goals? Most of the times, those are the longer term, unless there's some key inflection points that they're looking for, like a build out or something like that. But within that infrastructure or resourcing, they spend a lot of time on the people, hiring, firing, maybe we should say restructuring for the call. And then the other side is really on infrastructure support, like buying equipment. And in biotech, equipment's really big. And then also on buying a facility, whether there's a vivarium or whether it's just a cell culture lab or something of the like. So most of the times when I'm coming into that meeting, I'm hoping that the board has already read the pre-reads and there are no surprises. Like when I get there, everyone's pleasant. They ask a couple of key questions and then I'm asked to leave. So that's what I've observed with presenting at boards, both at the small and at the larger levels.
Have you thought about, so you're presenting to the board, and have you thought about if you were on the board, would you do something different? Would there?
So when I'm preparing, the financials or the operations or any kind of metrics, I'm always thinking, what would the board need to see to help move the company in the right direction? So I don't know if I would change anything. It's really just highlighting the key areas that I really want them to focus in on.
Thank you, Michonne. Paula, you have also presented to boards. You've been part of several startups. You have gone through some, IPOs and acquisitions, and you have seen many different board meetings from an operating perspective. What have you observed?
Well, I think from my perspective, because I've been at early stage to late stage companies that maybe have gone through financing, you've often met the board members before they were on the board. And so from my perspective, being an executive, it's really been around growth plans. And so, from the perspective of the quarterly meeting, it is perhaps on a yearly basis, it's what is going to be the plan. And then on a quarterly basis, checking in on the progress of the plan. And so, I would say that the board meetings, there shouldn't be any surprises, because actually any surprises should have been avoided because of discussion between the board meetings. So my experience working with boards is that the real value add can be outside of the board meetings. And so those would be some of my observations.
Paula, same question to you. If you would have been on the board of some of those meetings you've been part of, do you think, you would have done something different, or you observed, problems you would address? What is your perspective on that?
Well, I think when I think about the responsibility of the board, it's really around corporate governance. And, you know, there are two major elements of that, financial and organizational. And I believe what gets presented at a board meeting is just the summary. It's the presentation of something. And so as a board member, I think it is important to have sufficient communication with the CEO and executive team that you actually really understand what the nuances are of what is being presented. Because after all, what does the board and the executive team want? They want to be successful. And the best way to be successful is if you actually have visibility and understanding of the dynamics. And I'm particularly thinking about this from a growth perspective, because managing growth, it's not linear. You actually don't want it to be linear. And so, you know, I think checking in quarterly is great, but what's happening in between is also super important.
That might be a good segue to the next question. So when we were preparing for the meeting, we talked about it. Sometimes it can be, you know, the house is on fire, but when does this come up, you know, in these conversations, and when is the board aware of it? We talked about there should be no surprises, but Vishon, you had some interesting insights when we were talking about that. Maybe you can share that, and then we can have everybody else from our team, you know, kind of, talk about how can we have these more uncomfortable conversations earlier on, because even though there should be no surprises, still in many companies, you know, all of a sudden there's a problem. And even though the board might be aware of it right before, but what, to Paula's point, what happened between now the problem is there and before? So Vishon, if you could maybe comment on that, and then I would love to hear from Avital and everybody else on our panel.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I mean, this may be a little provocative, but I feel like most boards are networks of people that are friends and that know each other well, so they have a personal relationship. And oftentimes you don't want to bring up a lot of the uncomfortable conversations or daily operations. You try to fix it. It's almost like you don't want to tell your parents that the kids have been getting in trouble, so you try to fix it in the house before they get home. And I find that, like, for my superpower, it's really like, how do you, I'm very good at reading a room and bringing up and addressing uncomfortable situations and constructively problem solving those things. So, I'm an oldest child, clearly. I'm able to bring those issues up. And I think a lot of times what's missing in boardrooms is having a couple of people who are comfortable bringing up some of the issues that they may see on a daily basis. And this is kind of goes into what Paula was saying earlier around, there are no surprises, but you only get a high level summary because you want to present your best face to your parents or people that you respect. And I think, one of the challenges is how do you pepper in some of the challenges you're having and frame it in a way that you can have a constructive conversation to fix the problems and not have your parents freak out, for lack of a better word, and ground everybody and, have the party end. So I think it just really comes down to putting people in the boardroom that can help frame some of the tension or frame some of the conflict.
Avital, this is a good question for you. You're leading major engineering efforts. And, I work with a lot of startup companies in my day job. And oftentimes there's a problem with the product. It is not ready, right? Engineering has not delivered on the milestones. And that creates obviously big problems for the company. So what is your perspective, on these uncomfortable conversations earlier on?
Yeah, Rita, I mean, it's a great point, right? Back to what Mishan said, we're all, when we're getting ready for large leadership meetings, board meetings, all kinds of meetings, we are trying to put our best foot forward. And I think sometimes, again, maybe a little provocative, but there is a little bit of groupthink, right? Let's think about private boards for a minute. You've got the founders on the board who are definitely, biased towards the company and obviously doing right by the company. And then you've got the investors who poured millions of dollars into this, who have, again, we have fiduciary responsibilities, but there is that investor perspective in there. And so there's that tension. But there's also a little bit of, today, especially founders, I mean, the whole ecosystem is pretty pretty well known to each other. So there's people who work together, and which is a good thing. You work together for a while, tough times in early stage companies to get the company growing. And, you're bonding, you're getting everything right going. And that's when, who's going to bring up the elephant in the room? It becomes really hard. And this is where I find that adding, that independent member who, again, the person's been added to the board for good reason, because they brought something, to add to the CEO's experience. They brought something that the board, had identified as a gap. And this person really can then start to think about asking that hard question of the why, or have we considered? And I feel like, I should say, by the way, it's not diversity just of gender, it's diversity of thought, it's diversity of experience, age, ethnicity. I think that experience just makes people more open to the idea of considering different things, and helps create egalitarian boards, right? Where we're open to well, yes, we understand that this product's running behind. What are our different choices? What can we do? Do we consider other opportunities? So I think that diversity in the board really helps bring out these tough conversations that may not happen if there's groupthink sometimes.
Avital, thank you. That's a really excellent point. And it gets us actually to our last question, because we only have 20 minutes for our segment. So we have to get to the last question. And that is, what do you think are the most significant challenges and opportunities in this next decade? There's a lot of pressure right now on public companies to diversify. That is, there's a lot of pressure on, I think, diversifying leadership teams, giving opportunities to more people of the population. This is really a question for all of you on our panel. What do you think that means for companies? What do they need to do in the next few years to address these challenges and opportunities? Abby, you want to go first?
Sure. I think irrespective of the industry you're in or the size of your company, there's a lot of things changing, both in respect to the strategies for your company, but then also as a CEO and as a founder, how do you show up and manage the environment? We've seen this really play out over the last 6 to 12 months with the choices made by Basecamp and Coinbase, and how do you manage the expectations of both an evolving and expectations of your employee base, but also your shareholders and the market at large. And I think that the need for a more diverse perspective around the board is more important than ever. To Avital's point, how do you make sure that you're asking the hard questions in the boardroom where they should be asked versus seeing them play out in the public sphere? But more importantly, are you holding yourselves accountable both as a board, but also as a leadership team and supporting the leadership team of that company? And I think the board's role is going to become more prominent than ever to help these CEOs navigate such a quickly changing environment. And I think more and more CEOs should be encouraged to leverage their board is that both that opportunity to hash out really uncomfortable challenges they're going through, but get that support as well along the way. And then finally, boards are going to be expected to hold the CEOs accountable more often. And I think that's something that, to Mishan's point, how and when are we having those uncomfortable conversations, and are we broaching them in the boardroom in a way that is thoughtful, but the expectation is we're here to all make sure this company is successful in the long run.
Abby, thank you.
I want to add one point. I completely agree with everything Abby said. And I think also the landscape's changing, right? Like, for example, governance has always been a part of the board's responsibilities, but security and risk management is becoming so important these days with technology evolving. And I think that is an area where companies, your question earlier, Rita, also was where are there going to be more challenges? And I feel like that area really needs a lot of energy put into it.
I think we all agree. I mean, we've seen these, massive cases of ransomware and major disruption to the population, really, not just to the company or the organization, but to everybody else. Most recently the pipeline hack. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a really, really good point. Paula, what is your perspective?
I think any startup, but it's also true for public companies, picking up on Abby's point, investors, buyers of products are starting to evaluate not just the product, but the company's stance. And so I think societal issues are companies sort of awareness and responsiveness to that is going to be increasingly important. And so what are those issues like diversity, responsibility, the planet, privacy? I think that is going to be a huge issue about products and services that people are bringing to market. And so I think these issues, I think it comes from the very top down. It comes from the board to make sure that they're asking for what is the company's position? How are you measuring the sort of corporate performance, not just on financial issues, but on these other issues? And I know that the boards that I've reported to are already asking, like, what is the distribution of your workforce? And that's a start, but I think it's much wider ranging. And I actually think it's a fantastic development that corporations are not separate from society. They're an important part of society. And that involves many dimensions. So I see actually that being the biggest change, which I think is actually a very exciting new opportunity.
I want to just add one thing onto what Paula was saying, especially on the social relevance. Like when I think about a board and the pressure that people are feeling there, I want to reframe that to a competitive advantage, right? So if you're, looking at diversity, not just diversity, but equity and inclusion included in that part, it's going to help you recruit in a really highly competitive market, not just for people of color and for women, but also for very, I'm going to use the word woke individuals that want to work at companies that are, at the forefront of change. People want to do stuff that matters and be part of something that matters. So that's one thing that's important. And people look at who's in leadership and they look at who's on their board before making a jump. So if you really think that there's not a huge pipeline for certain individuals, it's because you're not actually attractive to those individuals, or you're not looking and you don't have the right networks. Mm-hmm. The second thing about adding into that board is around relevance, or around amplifying your network. So most people now in these small ecosystems, they know a person who knows another person who knows another person, but their network is still very insular. By adding more diversity into those boards, you're actually amplifying your network of people. They're out there, and then your pipeline will then increase, and you'll actually be able to recruit these people. And then the last thing is really around innovation. If you have diversity, studies have shown that when you have a diverse board or a diverse set of people, that your performance and your products are actually more successful. So if you really want to be on the forefront of innovation, you've got to shake it up. You've got to refresh that board. You've got to make sure you're getting people in there that have different perspectives and that are actually on the street and operating and can bring something of value back to the company to grow the company. But really, at the end of the day, if you remember nothing else, it's if you want to recruit talent, you gotta make it attractive for that talent, and they will find you.
Michonne, as an executive recruiter in my day job, I could not agree more. Mm-hmm. That is a huge, huge advantage if a company is more diverse in attracting, really that A candidate. So I agree. I think we're out of time on our segment. I'd like to turn this over to Rohini and have her lead the discussion of what VCs, how are VCs, talking about this.
Awesome. No, thank you, Rita, and to all the panelists. I think that was an excellent tee up, and we have our questions, and I think really, some of the thoughts that we echo a lot of the thoughts that the first panel expressed. Maybe to connect these two panels up, where this idea came from was exactly the point Michonne made on the network. And what we felt was there is a demand side to this where there are operating leaders who are preparing themselves to be on boards, and they would like to be on, especially on private company boards, as a way for them to give back to the startup ecosystem, to learn, to grow in their own careers. And actually on the other side, on the startup side and private company board side, there are actually opportunities. Many times independent boards go unfilled while companies are busy with other things. And we felt like the best way to build this out was to go talk to some venture investors who as part of their day jobs sit on boards and advise companies and invest in companies. And so I'm really thrilled to have Gary Little from Canvas Ventures and Tim Guleri from Sierra, who, I think they have excellent perspectives. What I want to do is maybe, rather than do an introduction on Gary and Tim, if you could take a few minutes and do a longish intro on each of yourselves, your firms, and sort of the types of boards you're on, that'll set the stage for this part of the conversation. So Gary, you're on mute.
Mute. Sorry. Thank you, Rohini. I'm Gary Little. I'm a co-founder and partner at Canvas Ventures. We started Canvas in 2013. It's a spin out of Morgan Thaler Ventures. We're between the two of those, I've been in venture now almost 25 years. I guess relevant to, and we're Series A, mainly software-oriented investments. I guess relevant to the discussion, I had the opportunity to co-found Canvas with a female partner. When I joined venture 25 years ago, there were no women in the first firm I was in. The second firm I was in, there was 15 partners, no women partners, no women associates. It was very male dominated. And in fact, most of the companies were, the founders and the like were primarily male. So I had an opportunity to kind of be part of this and watch it. In 2008, my prior firm was going through a transition and of succession because it was becoming a 50-year-old firm. And I was tapped to lead one of the teams, the technology team. And I met a woman at a Berkeley event that Abby knows. And we weren't looking for an associate. And certainly we're not out looking for a female, but I thought this person was pretty special, like really incredibly talented, invited her to become a senior associate of the firm. Turns out she was so good that within the fund she joined as a senior associate, she became one of the 3 highest carry partners in that same fund among the 15 partners. And that is the partner that I went on to co-fund Canvas with. And since that time, 2008, in the last 12 years, 40% of Canvas's investor and platform team are women. 34% of our portfolio companies have a female co-founder or CEO, and 50% of our portfolio companies have a female director. Now, pursuant to this panel, only 13% have a female independent director. So there's work to be done.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for the data as well. And then, yeah, Rebecca Lynn, for those of you who don't know her, is an amazing partner and, echo everything Gary said about the work you're doing. Tim, you want to just give us an intro on Sierra, and also serial entrepreneur. So you've kind of been on both sides. So maybe kind of the CEO's perspective too, if you want to add that in your intro.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you for the invite. I was looking forward to this panel. I'm Tim Guleri. I'm one of the managing directors at Sierra. And, like Gary, I've been in venture for 20 years. So I joined Sierra in 2002. And I call myself the accidental VC because I was an operator, as Rohini just said, before becoming the VC in 2002. I was early in a company called Scopus. It's actually a predecessor to Salesforce.com. And the company, which is the company public, and then sold it to Siebel Systems, which was now the granddaddy of CRM. And after that, I started my second company, Octane Software, which was an e-commerce infrastructure company focused on banking and telecom. Ran that for 5 years. And then after selling that, joined Sierra. So Sierra, I'll introduce the firm briefly and then go back to the topic. We are an early stage first institutional check focused on the B2B segment. So we do seeds and A's, investing our 12th fund. And the firm was started by Peter Bendel, a dear friend of mine and known to Rohini and Gary as well. Peter retired in 2012, and me and my two partners took over the partnership, and we further committed it to early stage. So we're investing our 12th fund, and we like to come early and stay late. Have kind of blue collar ethos as venture capitalists, doing the hard work to build companies, and hopefully they return big returns to our investors, which is kind of what's been happening. And obviously the market's very live and thriving, as we all see around us. When it comes to the topic at hand, so obviously I was CEO, and before that I was a senior exec when I was at Scopus. When I look back at my decade as an operator and then compare what I know now after being serving on boards as an investor, I think I was a pretty terrible board member or even a CEO for that matter when it came to board dynamics. And the reason I say that is because good things happen with experience, and you learn when you've been on board, both on as an operator or as a board member, on what a good board member looks like, and the kind of things that you should be doing, whether you're an operator or an independent board member. And after doing this for 20 years and serving on a couple of public boards now and private boards, I think there's definitely a method to the madness, and I'm super happy to be on this panel, and I'm sure we'll chat about things to do to get going in that direction. So thanks for the invite, Rohini.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And just to give a little bit more background on my own experience, I've been a venture investor for about 20 years as well. And before NGP, I was at NEA, which is a large venture firm, for 9 years. I think I've been I counted up, I've been on 15 venture boards. And so I do think, and many times I am the only woman, but actually increasingly I'm not. And so that's kind of a nice thing from my perspective. So the question to Gary and Tim, I think this comes up often, which is, Tim, you mentioned the work that goes into a startup, right? The startup starts up, you get involved, and typically the board forms with the founders and the investors, right? Maybe you can share a little bit of color on what happens at the board at those very early stages. Like, so what is the company worried about? If you want to just kick off give us a little bit of color on the board dynamics on an early private company board.
Yeah, I can maybe just at least frame the thinking, given that we do super early stage investing, which is effectively seeds, where you're trying to really get product market fit and then seeing if you can get the company going in the right direction. So initially there is no company, because it's just an idea and gleam in somebody's eye, and you're trying to figure out whether it's going to be a real business or not. So I think it's a lot of work is going on, and the board interplay is all about that product market fit, and is this dog gonna hunt, right, kind of conversations. But I think the minute you get to Series A and Series B, and you get a little more confident about the go-to-market and the dogs are eating the dog food, I think that's when the aperture opens up. And as a venture board member, the conversation starts happening on independent board members and who else to add to the board. And I think of this as sort of a layered cake when I think about what the right fit for the company's independent board member might be. And at the very core is obviously the core skills that we need coverage on. So for instance, if it's a product-oriented need, then you're looking for somebody that has product-oriented skills or engineering skills. If it's a sales and marketing, then it's that. If you're a later stage company, it might be finance, because you're looking for an audit chair or something along those lines if you're a public company. So I think the core skills is number one. The second is management skills, which is, I think, Abby, you mentioned, and Michelle, you mentioned, which is the dynamics and the way the board is conducted and how that person would actually, sort of add value to the board dynamics. And you audit for that, right? And the final thing is personal skills, which is super critical because ultimately an independent board member is the closest thing that a CEO has to a friend on the board as a advisor, because the venture guys, obviously we try to help the company and we're good guys, but I'm not sure the CEO has. I think the CEO needs to have somebody where they can have a very plain, direct conversation, and that is somebody that seat has to be filled and the role has to be filled by an independent board member. So that third layer of the cake, which is that personal skill set that you might build with a board member and vice versa with the CEO, becomes a very important consideration when certainly I'm thinking through and we're thinking through who a perfect board member might be. So I'll stop there. I'd love to see Gary's response, and then we can chat about how do you actually get that, actualized and done, which I think is probably pretty interesting and important.
Yeah, Gary, if you want to add to that, and also maybe an additional question on that is, the board, you're adding to the board and you're expanding the board. So you start with like this early stage board, which is typically the CEO and maybe there's one investor in there. And by the time you end up with as a public company, you typically have nine or 11 board members, with bringing different perspectives. Maybe you can call out some of the key points along the way where you're actively looking to add to the board, and so if you could just add some color on how the board evolves as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I might even just take a cut from like a venture perspective. When you're putting, I'd say, real money into the company, at some point the investors own a reasonable amount of the company, and at that time I think there's a desire to have a more of a balanced board that's not controlled by the founder, not controlled by the investor, but the independent can help create this balanced board. So that the decisions that the board makes are for the best interest of the company and not what's best for the individual founder or for the pockets of the VC. So that's kind of wired into a term sheet. In this environment, and this is at the earliest stage, the founders, have a lot of choice of venture capitalists to work with, and that therefore they have a lot of control over those term sheets and the like. And so I'd say typically that a lot of boards or a lot of investors say, great, you can pick that independent, and then as long as it is acceptable to the venture person, because the founder is worried about control. And so they're looking for somebody that they trust that's not going to throw them out of their job and out of their company. And they're really often really worried about that. And so that may be the hardest place to join the boards, is that first independent, and unless you are really in that network of that founder. So I'll just say one of the things, typically we're looking for somebody that has a founder experience or a CEO experience, certainly go-to-market experience, that can be a mentor to often a first-time CEO. So Mishan, like your background working as an early stage, you're a CEO, correct? Okay. Somebody that's had,
sorry about that.
or that founder, somebody that's had that founder experience or that CEO experience is particularly highly attractive at that early stage, but then needs to have that trusting relationship. So I'd just add, people that like yourselves, you're here because you're interested in getting on boards, things that you can get involved with to be advisors to companies, startup companies, or to help VCs with deal flow. Like if you hear of a good deal, start getting relationships with VCs or helping them with diligence, or even getting to know the talent, heads of talents at venture firms will help you get on the list of candidates. But I'd say that first one I just think is a harder one. As the company grows, though, then you're starting to look for, and I think first and foremost, people have been looking for functional diversity at the board. Okay, we seem to be strong at technical, we know the product and know what we want to build, but we're not very successful at selling it, or we're not very good at, finding partnerships with other large companies that can help this company. And so you start saying, gee, how can we add that expertise at the board? And again, we brought on a head of talent at our firm that is a female. And I always let her know every single search we're looking for at every company. And the first thing that comes out of her mouth is, great, let's look for some women candidates for these jobs. And so she brings it first of mind. And so I'd love to have, Rita, your organization connect with the heads of talents of all the VC firms as a way to get everybody on this list as candidates. And I'd say as the company gets closer to an IPO, let's say within a couple of years, you start planning, like, what does your board want to look like going into the IPO and post-IPO? And you have certain requirements. For example, somebody that's on the audit committee needs to have certain skill sets. That's not true earlier in this private company. And in fact, you need somebody to chair that audit committee. So for example, somebody that has CFO experience, we're just bringing on with one of our companies, somebody who's been a CFO, public company CFO, bringing on, and she's female, onto one of our companies that aspires to be public in the next year or two. So using your functional expertise that slot into what the company needs is really helpful. And at that time, also, a lot of the venture guys are going to get off the board right before the IPO or within 6 to 12 months after an IPO. And so that's the time, probably the best time for people on this call to be considered for board candidates. Because at that point, the company is large enough, they're going to be public, they're going to have public scrutiny. They're looking for both that diversity of skill set and experiences, but also that diversity of diversity, both gender and race and the other things that companies are looking for. But it's important to be on that list. So I'd say, just like you network to get a job, you actually have to network to get a board slot. And that's what you're doing here with First Board. But advising to companies and advising to venture firms are ways to build your own networks, build your own brand, so that you're first of mind, and then you become a known and trusted value-added source when people are thinking about board positions.
Thank you, Gary. So maybe the last question, and then we'll go to breakouts. Tim, maybe one of the things you mentioned was just the board dynamics and the culture of a board, right? So this is like any other group of people, there's an anthropology to the board, right? And maybe you can elaborate on the comment you made on, how do founders or investors think about, building the board, not just in terms of these strategic, like functional expertise or access to markets and things like that, but also in terms of how do you have a workable board and create a board dynamic that's actually helpful to the CEO and helpful to the company. If you could respond to that, and then what, just a logistical thing after we answer that question, Britta is going to break us up into 2 rooms, and we're going to mix up the panelists in there so people can continue to ask questions. But if you want to just address culture, and then we'll go to breakouts.
Yeah, I think what I'll just summarize, since we're running out of time here, is that the first realization that I had, after I went from an operating role to a venture role, is that as an operator, you're used to sitting on the first seat of the bus or the second seat of the bus or the third seat of the bus. As a board member, you're sitting on the 23rd seat of the bus, right? So that the first conceptual shift that has to happen is that you are not the one driving the bus. You're actually the one that is strategically looking forward and advising the CEO and the rest of the board in what direction to go. And that's a big, sort of a conceptual shift for operating people in any dimension when they transfer onto a private board or a public board. And that was a tough one for me. I was pretty bad as a board member in the first 2 years as a VC. And already at 3, I said, all right, my seat's back on the 23rd seat. And then you start looking at the whole world through strategic eyes. So that's number one. Number 2 is, I think, the gift of time, right? So this is the notion that you actually care about the mission of the company. You really care deeply about the entrepreneur and the CEO and their struggles. And you're willing to give them the gift of time, because everybody has skills and intellect, but you have the time to really devote, right, to that person's progression and therefore the company's progression. And if you have that, I think that's the bond that actually CEOs are looking for. And so my general advice to incoming board members is that, like Gary was saying, it's tough to break into a public company board right off the bat. So you've got to start, with smaller companies. And look, queen of a small country is still a queen, right? So if you're on a board of a small company, you have board experience, and you can project up from there. So I think the dynamic of the gift of time, the gift of advice, sitting on the back of the bus and being very strategic. And what I like to, quote often to my CEOs is when I'm in a board meeting, and this is something that Jeff Bezos talks about a lot, is the board's job is to investigate, talk about, and control the inputs. Because if you control the inputs, the outputs take care of themselves. And very often I find that boards kind of start talking about, okay, let's look at the numbers and just report on the numbers. But the numbers are actually a function of the inputs, and that's what the actual job of the board should be. So I would say that start early and start small. It's not a bad idea to be an advisor first. Get the kind of intellectual match with the CEO and the trust, and then transfer on to the board. I've seen many people do that very successfully. And then as the company grows, you grow with it. And then you can do a lateral move into a private company about to go public. And those are very, very natural transitions. But that's been my experience of a pretty successful roadmap.
Well, great advice. And so I want to thank all of the panelists. I think this has been an amazing session. Thank you for letting us experiment with the format a little bit. We just wanted to have both perspectives represented and tee up these conversations. So we'll go to, so thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tim, Abby, Avital, Nishan, Paula. And we'll head over to breakouts now. To the main session, I hope people had a chance to meet each other at the breakout rooms. In room 2, we were doing intros, and we had a couple of quick questions that we were going to answer if people could stay a little longer. I know we are done with the session, so it's optional if you want to drop off. But Gary, if you could stay for a minute and maybe take the question on, if you're coming from in this particular case, Diane said media. So what's the best way to get plugged into the private board network?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I heard was the question: if I'm from a large company, I don't have small company startup experience, can I add value? and Rohini, we're on a board together. A little plug to Rohini. She came in as a last investor. The CEO needed some mentorship. She stepped into the executive chairman role. Actually introduced the company to 2 of its most important partnerships that are generating revenue. And then helped recruit the follow-on financier and also this board member, which hasn't been announced. But the reason I do that wind up is this board member does not have small company, private startup experience, but comes from some of the largest, the most powerful tech companies out there. And what that person has is relationships, contacts, Rolodex, and brand name and cachet that can help the company open doors to partnerships and customers and talent. I think small companies are always trying to attach other people's stars to their companies. And so I'd say if you have some star power or network in your area that you can bring to a company that's valued, that's a valuable skill set.
Awesome. Thank you. With that, I think we will wrap up this session. Rita, do you want to provide some closing remarks? And first of all, I want to thank Britta Kinkeldade, my admin and our head of marketing at NGP, who I think has done, this must, she conceived of this event and pulled it together in record time. So big thank you to Britta, and off to Rita.
Yes, I want to second that. Thank you, Britta. We could have not done it without you. Britta and I share some background from Germany, so that made it easy to collaborate. And thank you, everybody, for being part of this discussion. I think we learned a lot. I did. I'm sure everybody on the meeting learned a lot too. And I hope we can talk more and continue our collaboration together. Thank you, Rohini, Gary, everybody who was here. Thank you very much.